The sun hung low and mean over the Arizona desert, burning the world into shades of copper and bone. Heat shimmered off the horizon like ghosts dancing in the air. Wade Ransom, a weathered rancher whose face carried more dust than laughter, rode slow along the dry riverbed. His old saddle creaked with every sway of his horse, and beside him trotted Shadow, a black shepherd with amber eyes sharp enough to read the wind. Wade had spent his life working the Ransom ranch. What was left of it, anyway? 100 acres of cracked soil, 2 surviving horses, and a barn that leaned like an old drunk. Folks said the land had given up, but Wade hadn't. A man doesn't leave his father's ground just because the rain forgets his name. That afternoon, the wind shifted. It came crawling from the west, dragging the scent of blood and smoke. Shadow stopped dead in his tracks. The dog's ears rose, his body stiff as wire. "What is it, boy?" Wade muttered, pulling on the reins. Shadow growled, low, steady, like thunder under the earth, and then took off across the flats. Wade cursed under his breath and followed. The mare fought him at first, hooves slipping in the sand, but he kicked her forward. They crossed a stretch of red stone and cactus spines until the world narrowed to a single shadow beneath a jagged boulder. There, half buried in dust, lay a woman. She was skin and bones, her lips cracked, her dress torn into ribbons of faded blue. Her skin was the color of sun-baked earth, and her hair, tangled and black as river pitch, clung to her face. Wade dismounted slowly. He'd seen death before, too many times, and she looked close to it. But Shadow crept forward, tail low, sniffed her hand, and whined. "She's still breathing, huh?" Wade knelt beside her, laid a calloused hand near her mouth. A faint warmth brushed his fingers. A breath, thin and fragile as paper. He poured a little water from his canteen, wet a rag, and touched it to her lips. She stirred, coughed once, the sound dry as gravel. Her eyelids fluttered open just enough for him to see their color, a deep, dark green like moss after rain. "Easy," Wade said softly. "You're safe." Her eyes didn't trust him. Not yet. They searched his face like a trapped animal checking for teeth. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, all bone and willpower, and he felt her pulse trembling against his chest. Shadow led the way, head low, as Wade carried her to the old hunting shack by the river, a place he hadn't touched since the roof caved last spring. By the time he laid her down on the cot, dusk was crawling in. The shack smelled of dust, old whiskey, and the long silence of forgotten years. He lit a lantern. The flame flickered weak, the kind of light that made ghosts out of shadows. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a whisper, rough, foreign, like a language shaped by wind. "Name?" Wade asked quietly. She swallowed hard. "Luta," she said at last. "Means fire." Wade nodded, staring into the small flame between them. He'd heard Apache words before, usually from men screaming them on battlefields. But this one carried something different. He gave her more water, tore an old shirt to bandage the wound on her arm. The burn mark there was strange, circular, deliberate, like a brand. That night, while the desert turned black and the coyotes started their lonesome singing, Wade sat beside the dying fire, rifle across his lap. Shadow slept near the door, ears twitching at every sound. And inside the dim orange glow, the Apache woman breathed slow and shallow, her scar catching the light like a ring of ash. Wade didn't know why, but something in that mark chilled him more than the night air. He'd seen it once before, years ago, pressed into the wax of an old letter with his name on it. He leaned back against the wall, eyes heavy but restless. "Fire," he murmured. "Yeah, that fits." Outside, the wind rose over the canyon, carrying with it the first whisper of a reckoning still miles away. The storm came and went like most things in the desert, sudden, violent, and gone before a man could blink. By the third evening, the rain had already baked into the soil, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet dust and mesquite. Inside the old shack, the world felt still, the kind of still that pressed on a man's chest until he could hear his own sins breathing. Wade Ransom sat by the hearth, sharpening a knife that hadn't seen use in months. Across from him, Luta lay on the cot, wrapped in a wool blanket that once belonged to his father. Her eyes followed the light slipping through the window slats. She didn't say much, never did, but there was something in the way she watched the wind move the trees, like she could understand what it was whispering. Shadow rested near her feet, chin on his paws, eyes half open and listening. That dog had more sense than most men Wade knew. He never barked unless the world was about to change. Wade had patched her wounds as best he could, whiskey, boiled cloth, and a steady hand. She'd lived through something fierce, he could tell. Her ribs were too sharp, her wrists too thin, and that strange burn on her left arm caught his eye every time she moved. A perfect ring of scar tissue, dark as coal, smooth as glass. One night, while the fire was low and the crickets had taken over the silence, Wade leaned closer and looked again. He wasn't sure why he did. Maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper gnawing at him. "That mark," he said quietly. "You born with it?" Luta didn't turn from the window. "No one's born with fire," she murmured. He sat back, the answer sitting heavy in the air. The ring reminded him of something old, buried deep in his memory. He rose, walked to the saddlebag near the door, and dug through a few weather-worn papers until he found what he was looking for. A folded letter, edges yellowed by time. He hadn't opened it in years. The seal was long broken, but the wax mark still clung to the paper. A burned circle, almost identical to the scar on her wrist. He stared at it, a chill creeping up his spine despite the heat. That seal had come from Silas Wexler, a name he'd tried to forget. A wealthy trader from the East, the kind of man who saw people as property and promises as currency. His father, Hank Ransom, once made a deal with Wexler, a marriage arrangement meant to join two worlds. Wade would marry Wexler's daughter, half white, half Apache, and in return, the Ransoms would get land rights to the valley near Sundown Ridge. Wade had been 20 then, too proud, too restless to be tied to a deal made in whiskey and shame. But before the wedding could ever happen, her village burned. Raiders, they said. No survivors. And now she lay there, breathing softly under his roof. He folded the letter back into his coat. There were too many ghosts stirring, and he'd learned long ago not to trust coincidences in this land. Luta finally looked at him, eyes the color of old pine needles, unreadable and calm. "You keep staring like you've seen me before," she said. "Maybe I have," Wade answered. "Or maybe I'm just seeing what's left of something that used to matter." She didn't smile. "Then stop looking backward, rancher. The wind doesn't." Wade chuckled low, though it wasn't out of humor. He poured her a bit of water and leaned back near the fire. Shadow shifted, nose twitching toward the door, ears up again. Wade glanced at him. "Easy, boy. Ain't nobody coming out here." But the dog didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the window, on the horizon where thunder rolled faint and distant. Wade followed that gaze and saw nothing but darkness stretching for miles. Still, he felt it. The old pull of trouble, quiet and steady, like a hand tugging at the back of his neck. Somewhere out there, ghosts were waking, and one of them carried her name. By the fourth morning, color had returned to Luta's face, though her eyes still carried the weight of things no woman should have to remember. The desert sun slid through the cracks of the shack's walls, cutting the air into bright, dusty lines. Outside, Shadow paced the porch, half guard, half ghost, his ears twitching to sounds that only the desert could hear. When she finally spoke, her voice came low and rough, shaped by smoke and memory. "They called themselves the Hollow Men," she said. "They came from the south, men without names, without prayers. They took women from our camps, traded them for whiskey, bullets, and horses." Wade said nothing. He knew that kind of cruelty. He'd seen it back when soldiers wore blue coats and good intentions, and towns burned anyway. Luta's gaze fixed on the fire pit, watching the coals breathe in the wind. "They killed my brother first. He tried to fight them. They left him hanging in the canyon to remind the rest." Her hands tightened on the blanket draped around her shoulders. "They sold me to a man near the border. I escaped during a storm. The river carried me north until I couldn't remember my own name." Wade didn't interrupt. A man who's worked cattle and buried kin learns the worth of silence. When she finished, only the fire dared to speak, snapping like old bones. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And they're still out there?" Luta nodded once. "They move camps. Never stay long. Folks say they ride at sundown. That's why they call them hollow. You only hear the horses, never see the men." Wade's jaw tightened. He looked into the fire, saw faces he'd rather forget, flames swallowing towns, screams tangled in the wind. Some scars don't live on the skin. "You plan on hunting them?" he said more as a truth than a question. Her eyes flicked up, sharp as flint. "I plan on ending them." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the cracked boards. Then Wade sighed, deep and slow, as if dragging the words from somewhere he'd kept buried. "Well," he said, "you won't be doing it alone." Luta stared at him, unreadable. "You don't owe me anything, rancher." He looked up, and the firelight cut his face in half, one side worn by years of dust and work, the other shadowed by something quieter. "I ain't talking about debt," he said. "I've seen what men like that do, seen what they take. If there's still one breath left in me, I ain't letting 'em keep it." Shadow raised his head then, as if he understood every word. The wind outside grew restless, sweeping through the canyon with a long, hollow cry. Luta watched the flames curl, her voice soft now, nearly a whisper. "My people used to say the desert remembers. Every wrong, every name." Wade poked the fire with a stick, sparks lifting into the smoke like dying stars. "Then I reckon it's time we reminded the desert who they are." She said nothing more, but in the flicker of the firelight, Wade saw it. The shift in her eyes, a quiet storm gathering behind the calm. When the coals dimmed and the night fell heavy, Shadow crept closer to her cot and lay down, his fur brushing her hand. She didn't pull away. Outside, coyotes howled across the canyon, their cries echoing off stone and silence. Wade sat with his rifle across his knees, watching the last of the embers fade. He didn't pray. But for the first time in years, he felt the stirring of something close, not mercy, not hope, but purpose. And out there, somewhere in the dark, the hollow men were still breathing. The mornings came cold in that part of Arizona, the kind of cold that bit through denim and memory alike. Wade Ransom rose before the sun, like he always did, and found Luta already awake, standing in the pale blue light outside the cabin. Her hair whipped in the wind, her hands resting on the rifle he'd given her. She wasn't the same woman he'd pulled out of the dust weeks ago. The weakness was gone, burned out of her like sickness. In its place stood something sharper, something forged. "Try again," Wade said, stepping beside her. She inhaled slow, the rifle braced firm against her shoulder. He watched her chest rise and fall, steady as a tide. The morning wind hissed across the dry plain. She waited, finger resting on the trigger. Patient. When she fired, the sound cracked through the valley, and the can Wade had set on a fence post spun into the dirt. "Better," he said. She looked at him once, not smiling, not proud, just sure. For days, they practiced in the emptiness behind the shack. Wade taught her to breathe with the rhythm of the land, to feel the wind before it moved, to listen for what didn't belong. He corrected her stance, her grip, her timing. Luta learned faster than any ranch hand he'd ever trained. Every shot she took landed closer to the mark. Every night she sat by the fire, cleaning the colt piece by piece, her eyes never leaving the flame. To him, she no longer looked like a survivor. She looked like a storm waiting to break. It was near dusk when they found the first body. They'd ridden out past the ridge, following the dry creek where the coyotes liked to scavenge. Shadow stopped first, nose pressed to the wind, tail stiff. Wade swung down from his horse and saw a man half buried under mesquite roots, dust-covered, boots torn, a bullet clean through his chest. Luta crouched beside the corpse, her fingers brushing the dirt off his coat. "He's one of them," she said, voice flat. "How you know?" She reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin, black, heavy, and carved with a mark Wade had never seen before. A perfect circle, slashed through the middle like a wound that never healed. Her hand trembled just once. Then she spoke, quiet but certain. "That's their sign, the Hollow Men." Wade turned the coin in his fingers. The symbol glinted in the dying light. "Hell of a thing to die carrying." Luta's gaze hardened. "It's the mark they leave behind. The last thing my people saw before fire took them." For a long while, neither spoke. The desert stretched wide around them, endless and empty, yet somehow listening. Then Luta said, almost to herself, "I remember the man who sold me to them. A trader, white coat, soft hands." She looked up at Wade, her voice steady as steel. "His name was Wexler." Wade froze. For a second, the world went still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. That name, Silas Wexler, struck him like a hammer. His father's business partner. The man who'd written that damned letter. The man whose signature had tied their families together in blood and deceit. He swallowed hard. "You're sure?" Luta nodded. "I'd know his face even in hell." Wade slipped the coin into his pocket, feeling its weight like a curse. The sun was sinking, painting the land in red and gold, the color of old sins coming due. He looked out toward the horizon, where the sky bled into shadow. "Then we find him," he said. Luta rose, her hand tightening on the rifle. Shadow barked once, sharp and low, as if sealing a pact only the wind could hear. Wade met her eyes. "You get your revenge, Luta. But once it starts, it don't stop easy." She turned towards the setting sun, her face lit in firelight. "Neither do I." The wind carried her words across the desert like an oath, and for the first time in years, Wade Ransom knew the past was riding hard to meet him. They reached Dust Whip by late afternoon, when the sun hit the town sideways and the wind carried more grit than mercy. The place looked half dead, a scattering of shacks leaning into each other for balance, a saloon that hadn't been swept since the war, and a main street bleached white by the desert. The sign outside the saloon creaked in the wind. Paint peeled off to a faint word that once read, "Mercy's End." Wade thought it fit the place just fine. Inside, smoke hung thick, and the floorboards moaned under his boots. Cards slapped, whiskey poured, and every face turned when Luta walked in behind him, silent, steady, eyes sharp as flint. Shadow padded close to her side, tail low, teeth quiet but ready. At the far table sat Zeke Parrish, a gambler with fingers stained by tobacco and greed. He looked up, half drunk, half curious, until something dark clattered across his cards. A black coin, its etched circle glinting in the lamplight. His face changed color. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, voice dry as a cactus spine. Luta said nothing. Wade stepped forward, his shadow swallowing the table. "We're asking the questions, friend." Zeke tried to laugh it off, but Wade's hand shot out, grabbing him by the collar, slamming him against the post behind his chair. The saloon went dead quiet. Even the piano player froze mid-chord. "I'll ask once," Wade said low. "Where's the man who runs with these?" He tapped the coin against Zeke's forehead. Zeke swallowed hard. "You don't want to cross them, folks. They ain't right." Wade tightened his grip. "Neither am I." A punch later, Zeke coughed blood and truth. "Royce Kellen," he spat. "He's got a camp south of Black Ridge Canyon, runs with 6 men, keeps women chained in wagons. He pays in gold and burns what's left." Wade let him fall to the floor. "Appreciate it," he said, tossing a coin onto the table. "Not black this time, just silver. For the whiskey you'll need after this." They rode out before dusk, the sky turning to fire over the canyon. The wind howled through the rocks like it carried ghosts, and the smell of smoke rose before they ever saw the campfire. From a ridge above, Wade spotted movement, 2 sentries pacing near the wagons. Cole Briggs and Tanner Reed, by the look of their worn hats and rifles. He glanced at Luta. 2 guards, 20 yards apart. You take the left." She nodded once, knelt in the dust, raised her rifle. The shot cracked like thunder. One man fell before the other even turned his head. The second barely had time to draw before Wade's bullet found him. They moved fast and quiet, shadow leading through the brush. Down below, the camp sprawled around a dying fire. Royce Kellen sat beside it, coat open, pistol loose in his hand. A man too used to others dying first. 2 women sat chained near a wagon wheel, Nora Bell and June Carter, faces pale, eyes hollow. Luta stepped into the circle of firelight, rifle leveled. Kellen blinked, drunk and slow. "Well, hell," he said with a smirk. "Didn't think they made angels with Apache eyes." Her reply was a gunshot. He fell back hard, the firelight painting red across his shirt. For a moment the camp was silent but for the crackle of flame and the whisper of wind. Wade cut the chains from the women, their sobs swallowed by the desert. He didn't look at Luta, didn't need to. She stood over Kellen's corpse, her rifle smoking, her expression unreadable. Then she crouched, picked up the black coin that had rolled from his pocket, and tossed it into the fire. The metal hissed, melted, vanished into ash. She whispered something in Apache, low, steady, and the flames roared higher, as if they'd understood. Wade caught only one word of it. Justice. When they rode away, the camp burned behind them, painting the canyon walls in orange and gold. Shadow trotted ahead, the night wind carrying the faint echo of hoofbeats that didn't belong to them. Wade didn't turn back. Some fires, he knew, were meant to keep burning. The trail to St. Ellison cut through the kind of country that looked like God had given up halfway through making it, flat, colorless, and mean. Dust followed Wade, Ransom, and Luta for miles, curling behind their horses like ghosts that refused to rest. By the time they reached the edge of town, the sky had turned the color of old brass. St. Ellison wasn't like Dust Whip. This place was alive, but not in a way that felt right. The streets were clean, the storefronts freshly painted, and the people carried themselves like they'd never known hunger. Yet beneath the shine, Wade could smell rot. At the top of the hill stood a white mansion that didn't belong to this land. Too fine, too polished, like it had been built to mock the desert itself. Inside that house lived Mason Hale, a man who bought Apache land with stolen signatures and blood-soaked gold. They hit town at sundown. Wade tied the horses behind the courthouse while Shadow kept low and quiet. Luta pulled her hat brim down, eyes narrow beneath the shadow. "He forged my death," she said, voice low and hard. "Now I'll return the favor." Wade gave a single nod. He'd seen that fire before, the kind that didn't need permission to burn. The courthouse door was locked, but not for long. Luta's boot slammed into it once, and the wood splintered open. Inside, the hall smelled of paper, whiskey, and power. She moved fast, prying open drawers, tearing through ledgers. Her hands stopped on a leather folder sealed in red wax, the same brand mark Wade had seen on her wrist. She opened it. Inside were deeds, a half-dozen pages stamped with Silas Vexler's name. Beneath it, she found a death certificate bearing her own. Her throat tightened, though her face stayed stone. "They declared me dead," she whispered. "Sold my father's land for gold and a lie." Wade's jaw clenched. "Your father didn't sell you, Luta. Vexler did. Some men don't just trade land, they trade souls." Before she could answer, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Mason Hale appeared in the doorway, cigar glowing red between his fingers, a smirk cutting across his face. He looked at the broken lock, then at her, and laughed. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, voice dripping with arrogance. "The ghost of the Apache girl. You should have stayed buried, sweetheart. The world's kinder to the dead." Luta didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, cold and calm. Wade took a step forward, but she raised a hand. Not for him, for silence. Hale exhaled a puff of smoke, still grinning. "You think killing me brings your people back? You think vengeance makes you clean?" She spoke softly. "No, but it makes the world honest for a moment." He opened his mouth to speak again, but her gun was already up. The shot echoed through the marble hall like thunder. Mason Hale fell back against the wall, the cigar still burning between his fingers before dropping to the floor. The bullet hole between his eyes was small, neat, precise, final. Wade didn't flinch. He'd seen enough men die to know when one deserved it. Luta stood still for a heartbeat longer, staring at the body. Then she bent down, tore the deeds from his pocket, and dropped them into the fire that licked up from his cigar's ember. The papers curled, blackened, and turned to ash. Outside, the wind picked up. A storm was rolling in from the south, the kind that turned sand to knives and sky to flame. When they stepped out, the mansion was already burning. The flames climbed the white walls like justice itself, wild and unforgiving. People in town gathered on porches, whispering, watching the sky glow red. St. Ellison trembled under the roar of fire. Wade mounted his horse, glancing once at Luta. Her face glowed in the light, fierce, steady, untamed. "What now?" he asked. She looked at the blaze and said quietly, "Now, the desert takes back what was stolen." Shadow barked once, the sound carried by the rising wind, and behind them the house of lies fell to dust. The desert had its own kind of silence, the kind that hummed in a man's bones long after the wind stopped. For days, Wade, Ransom, Luta, and Shadow rode beneath that silence, the horizon stretching endless and cruel. Every night, the stars looked closer, and every morning Luta woke with the same name on her lips. Meera. She spoke it in her sleep, soft but certain, like a prayer she'd carried too long. One night, by the dying campfire, she told Wade the truth. She was just a child when they took us. She sang when they hurt her, said it kept her from being afraid. Her voice cracked once, barely. I thought she was dead. But she's not. I saw her face again, in my dream. Wade didn't argue. He'd learned that when a woman like Luta spoke of dreams, it wasn't about superstition. It was memory trying to find its way home. The next day, they reached Stonewater, a mining town buried in dust and despair. The air stank of sulfur and sweat. Shacks leaned against the hills like they were too tired to stand. Men with hollow eyes coughed up silver and blood in equal measure. At the edge of town, they met Amos Dyer, an old miner with hands blackened by years underground. He spat into the dirt when Wade told him what they were after. "You're looking for the girl," Amos said, glancing around. "Then you're looking for the devil. Name's Jed Holt. Owns half this town, and every soul in it." Luta's expression didn't change. "Then we start with the other half." That night, Wade and Luta gathered the men who still remembered what freedom felt like. Clay Barrett, Roy Gannon, and Eli Pike among them. They met in the broken-down saloon, the air thick with dust and anger. "We ain't lawmen," Wade said, "but we know what right looks like." Eli slammed his fist on the table. "You think we ain't tried? Holt's got guns, guards, and the sheriff in his pocket." Wade leaned forward. "Then we take his pocket and set it on fire." They struck just before midnight. The miners set dynamite along the rail line, and the blast ripped through the canyon, shaking the ground like thunder. Men poured from the shafts, shouting. In the chaos, Luta and Wade rode straight for the main mine. Smoke stung the air. Shadow led the way, teeth bared, barking toward the shaft doors. 2 guards tried to stop them. They didn't get a second chance. Inside, the tunnels were damp and narrow, the walls glittering faintly with ore. Luta's lantern trembled in her hand as they reached a locked cellar door. From behind it came a sound, a weak, hoarse voice, singing a tune too pure for a place that dark. Wade kicked the lock open. The room smelled of rust and sorrow. Chains hung from the walls. And there, crouched beside a barrel, was a girl, no older than 12, her hair tangled, her eyes wide and bright despite everything. Luta dropped the lantern, fell to her knees, and pulled the child close. "Meera," she breathed, her voice breaking like glass. "You found the dawn." Behind them, heavy footsteps echoed. Jed Holt storming in, shotgun raised, face red with rage. "You don't belong here, squaw," he snarled. Luta stood, placing Meera behind her. "No," she said calmly. "You don't." Her revolver fired once. The shot lit the tunnel brighter than any torch. Holt staggered, blood blooming on his vest, and collapsed against the ore wall. When the miners found them minutes later, Luta was still kneeling beside the girl, whispering to her in Apache as the flames outside turned the night red. By dawn, Stonewater was free. The mine burned, the chains melted, and the people stood in the streets like they'd just remembered what it meant to breathe. Wade looked at Luta, her hair ash-dusted, her eyes reflecting the sunrise. She smiled faintly, holding Meera close. "She's seen the morning again," she said. "That's enough." The wind swept through the valley, carrying away the last of Holt's smoke. And for once, the desert felt quiet, not empty, but alive. Hollow Creek sat quiet between two ridges, where the cottonwoods met the dry wind, and time seemed to forget itself. For the first time in years, Wade Ransom's hands were clean of gunpowder. He and Luta had traded the roar of revenge for the creak of porch boards and the hum of a steady river. They built a life out of scraps, a small log cabin with smoke curling from the chimney and a fence line that barely held against the coyotes. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Meera grew fast beneath that roof. The child who once trembled in the dark now laughed freely, her voice ringing through the valley like a song the desert had long forgotten. Wade taught her to ride, first slow circles around the corral, then wild sprints across the flats. Luta showed her how to steady her aim, to feel the breath of the wind before pulling the trigger. "Never shoot in anger," she said, "only in truth." Each evening, they gathered on the porch as the sky bled into gold and violet. Wade would whittle wood, Meera would braid Shadow's fur, and Luta, silent, steady, would carve something small into a log by the steps. It was a circle burned into the grain, crossed through by a single line of fire. Ashmark, a symbol born from scars, it became the name for what they were. Not outlaws, not saviors, but something in between. The Ashmark was their promise, to protect those the world forgot, to stand between the innocent and the cruel. Word of them spread slow, carried by whispers and travelers. Those in need found a way to Hollow Creek. Sometimes a mother seeking her lost boy, sometimes a ranch hand running from debt and fists. Wade gave them work. Luta gave them purpose. When the law came sniffing, and it always did, they had a friend who warned them first. Padre Esteban, the one-eyed priest, rode down from the mission every few weeks. His horse was old, his voice soft as wind through reeds, but his news cut deep. He'd bring food, medicine, and letters from towns that didn't dare speak Luta's name aloud. "They think you're ghosts," he'd chuckle. "And maybe that's best." He stayed for supper each time, blessing their table in Spanish and Apache both. "There are two kinds of saints," he said once, "the kind who kneel and the kind who ride." Luta only smiled at that. As seasons turned, Shadow grew slower. His muzzle grayed, his steps grew stiff, but he still refused to sleep anywhere except by the front door. When storms came, he'd raise his head and stare out toward the dark hills, as if guarding something only he could see. Meera would sit beside him, stroking his fur, whispering secrets a child should never have had to keep. One night, as thunder rolled far off, Wade found Luta sitting outside with a lantern and that same circle carved into her palm. The wind tugged at her hair, and her eyes caught the flame. "You think it's over?" she asked quietly. He looked past her, to the horizon where the mountains cut the stars. "Ain't never over," he said, "but it's quieter now." She nodded, pressing her thumb against the mark until it burned faintly red again. "Then we'll keep watch. For those who can't." Inside, Meera slept beside Shadow, one hand resting on the old dog's side, feeling it rise and fall like the heartbeat of the desert itself. The night air was cool, full of promise and ghosts, and for the first time since he could remember, Wade felt peace settle like dust, soft, heavy, and real. Out beyond the porch, the Ashmark shimmered faintly in the moonlight, carved into the heart of the land. And when the wind blew through Hollow Creek, it carried no sorrow, only the quiet song of the living who'd finally learned to survive. The rain came slow that night, whispering through the cottonwoods that bordered Hollow Creek. The storm wasn't angry, just tired, the kind of rain that carried stories from faraway places. Wade Ransom sat by the fire, boots off, whiskey in hand, the smell of wet earth crawling in through the cracks of the cabin walls. Luta was sewing a patch onto Meera's blanket, her hand steady even as thunder rolled across the ridge. Shadow, old and gray-faced, lifted his head now and then, ears twitching at the sound of the rain. Peace was a rare thing, and they'd learned not to take it for granted. Then came the knock. 3 dull thuds on the door. Slow, hesitant, but sure. Wade set his glass down and stood. Luta's hand slid quietly toward the rifle leaning against the wall. When Wade opened the door, a stranger stood there, soaked to the bone, hat dripping, eyes shadowed under the brim. "Name's Dax Boone," he said, voice low and rough from the road. "I came from the south, from Dry Hollow." Wade eyed him a moment before stepping aside. "You looking for shelter or trouble?" "Maybe both," Dax said, walking in. He took off his hat, revealing a young man with the kind of face that hadn't yet learned how cruel the world could be, but soon would. Luta poured him coffee, silent as always. He nodded a thanks before speaking again. 3 girls have gone missing, all of them from the mining camps near Dry Hollow. The sheriff won't lift a damn finger. Says they ran off, but folks know better." Wade leaned against the hearth. "You got money to pay for this kind of ride?" Dax looked him dead in the eye. "No, sir. Ain't got $1 to my name." He paused, his voice quiet but certain. "But I got heart." For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire cracked, the rain tapped against the glass, and Shadow gave a low, restless growl, as if sensing something already written in the wind. Luta studied Dax. There was something in him. Not courage, not foolishness, but that same unshakable fire she once carried across the desert. Finally, she said, "Then you'll ride with us." Meera, sitting by the window, looked up, her eyes wide. "Mama, it's dangerous, ain't it?" Luta nodded slowly. "That's why we go." By morning, the rain had cleared, leaving behind a washed-out sky and the smell of sage. Wade saddled the horses, checking the rifles, the rope, the canteens. Meera tied a red ribbon to her saddle horn, the same one Luta had given her after the fire at Stonewater. Padre Esteban came by as they mounted up. The one-eyed priest made the sign of the cross in the dust. "You can't save everyone," he said softly. Luta swung into the saddle. "No," she replied, "but we can save the ones who still believe someone will try." The priest smiled faintly. "Then may the Lord ride in your shadow." The group rode out as the sun broke through the clouds, spilling light across the wet land. Shadow trotted ahead, his old frame still carrying that same silent strength. Dax Boone rode just behind Wade, jaw tight, eyes set on the horizon. He didn't talk much. Men who came with truth in their hearts rarely did. As they reached the ridge, Luta turned for one last look at Hollow Creek, the home they'd built, the quiet they were leaving behind once again. "Feels like the desert's callin'," Wade said. "It never stopped," she answered. Then she spurred her horse forward, and the sound of hooves thundered through the valley. 5 souls riding toward a fight the desert itself seemed to hold its breath for. And somewhere far ahead, in the red dust of Dry Hollow, evil waited, the kind that wore human faces and prayed to gold instead of God. But this time, it wouldn't go unpunished. The wheat fields of Hollow Creek swayed like an ocean of gold beneath the afternoon sun. Years had passed since gunfire, and dust had been their language. The land had healed, slow, stubborn, like the people who lived on it. Meera rode the fence line that day, her hair tied back with a faded yellow ribbon, the same one Luta had given her long ago, when she was still a trembling girl learning how to hold a gun steadier than her fear. She was grown now, tall and strong, her laughter echoing across the valley like music the desert thought it had forgotten. By the porch stood Wade, Ransom, and Luta, older, quieter, the weight of years sitting gently on their shoulders. The air smelled of wheat and wood smoke. For once there was no tension in it, just peace. At the edge of the field, beneath the shade of an old oak, rested Shadow. The old dog had passed some seasons back, his body finally giving way to time. Wade had carved a small headstone himself, simple and honest, like the dog it honored. He found her in the dust. That was all it said. And it was enough. Every morning, Luta left a handful of sage by that stone, Apache tradition, a gift for the spirit that guarded them still. Wade never said anything about it, but sometimes, when the wind blew just right, he could have sworn he heard a bark carried through the air. Faint, distant, like an echo from another life. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the red hills, the two of them stood side by side, watching the horizon bleed into gold and fire. Luta's voice broke the quiet. "If you hadn't found me that day..." She paused, her words almost lost to the wind. "If you'd ridden past..." Wade smiled, that slow, weathered kind of smile born from dust and faith. "Then the desert would have found another way." She looked at him, the corners of her lips softening. "The Apache believe the soul always finds its way back. Maybe I just went ahead to find you first." The wind stirred her hair, carrying the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth. Wade took her hand, rough meeting rough, and for a moment, the years between then and now folded into silence. Beyond them, Meera rode home, her horse cutting through the tall grass. She waved when she saw them, her smile bright as daylight. Wade lifted his hand in return, feeling something in his chest loosen, something he didn't have a word for. The cicadas began to sing. The sky deepened into a burning copper, and Hollow Creek glowed like a memory that refused to fade. Luta turned to him one last time. "Do you ever think it ends?" He looked toward the horizon, the same one that had once carried fire, smoke, and ghosts. "Not out here," he said softly. "The wind don't forget. It just carries the stories farther down the line." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. Together they watched as the last light disappeared behind the hills, where the sun died slow and the night came honest. Behind them, the house stood small but steady against the coming dark, smoke curling up into the endless sky. The mark of the ash mark still burned faintly on the wood, a promise carved in flame, a reminder that even in ruin, something pure can survive. The wind rose again, sweeping through the wheat, lifting dust and sunlight together until they danced like ash, glowing, weightless, eternal. And if you listened close, through the sigh of that wind, you might still hear a dog's soft bark, a woman's quiet laugh, and the whisper of a love the desert itself chose to remember.